morning, everybody. How are we today? Good. All right. I'm feeling a bit of energy here. Excellent. Look, it's a great pleasure to be here. This is about my fourth or fifth visit to Korea. I was here, 6 years ago when everyone was talking about enterprise blockchain, and I was happy to be invited a number of times in. And so it's exciting to be here at the cusp, I think, of a new transformational moment in our industry. I've been invited to talk to you a little bit about the past, present, and future of blockchain, and I figured the best way for me to do that, in fact, is to talk about my own journey through this space, which has been going for about 12 years now, largely through journalism. And the ups and downs of that, all of which speak to the volatility that we constantly experience in this space. But I will say to you guys that I think there's nothing less than we could expect, because the technology itself is transforming the very core of our financial system and our system of governance. It goes to the heart of trust, and anything like that is going to be disruptive and therefore volatile. So my journey, let's get the slides going. Here we go. My journey begins in Argentina, where I was the bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, and I experienced there just this relentless problem of financial crises. That country has inflation problems all the time, relentless ups and downs, and I realized at the time that there's a core problem of trust. Nobody trusted the government, and nobody trusted the currency. And then I left Argentina in 2009, went back to the United States, and a little company called Lehman Brothers had created a bit of a problem, and the global financial system was now undergoing exactly the same problem. A lack of trust in the institutions that run our financial systems is at the core of what happened at that time, and it made me realize that we just have this deep foundational problem within our financial system, within our systems of government, and there needed to be a better solution. And then I was asked out for dinner one night by a guy called Jeremy Allaire. Many of you may have heard of him. He's the founder and CEO of Circle. At that time, it was a relatively small company just running a Bitcoin wallet. And he said, look, you and a few other journalists are not quite understanding this. Why don't you come out for dinner and we'll talk about it? And somebody at that dinner was able to say to me, you know what, if Argentines had a currency that was based upon math and immutable truths and sort of the probabilities of that, rather than on having to trust a person, a human being within a government, imagine how it would be different. And my mind was blown, and from then on, I got very excited about Bitcoin, and my colleague at the Wall Street Journal at the time, Paul Vigna, and I ended up becoming the first mainstream journalists to cover cryptocurrencies, and we wrote a book called The Age of Cryptocurrency. But at the same time, this thing called Mt. Gox, if you remember that. Who remembers Mt. Gox? Yep, okay. That was really the first big blow up, the first FTX, if you like. And what it exposed was that even in our own industry, we faced the same problem, right? Mt. Gox was a very poorly regulated, very badly managed, centralized exchange. And without any of those protections around it, we were left having to once again trust individuals and companies to deliver this. And so it was a reminder that in our own industry, we have to grapple with the same challenges of trust. But a lot of other journalists at that time just stopped writing about Bitcoin. Mt. Gox was a joke. The price fell. It had gone up to 1,000 and then dropped all the way to 200. But I was fascinated by the idea that the technology underneath the blockchain could be so transformative. And I'd met Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum. This idea of an entirely new, unstoppable internet emerged with smart contracts. But you know what? Business was getting interested in this. Wall Street was getting interested in it. But they didn't like the idea of Bitcoin or Ethereum, these permissionless systems. They wanted permissioned systems. So we had this early idea of blockchain, or enterprise blockchain as we called it. And companies like Maersk did it for supply chains and shipping. And the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, DTCC, was trying to create a blockchain-based model for the financial systems. All of it based on this permissioned model. And so you still had to trust an entity in the middle of it. And in the end, they all failed, because the real innovation lies in opening the system up and being permissionless, which is what Bitcoin and Ethereum are based on. But it was very difficult to scale because blockchains are inefficient. At this stage, I had left and gone to MIT, so I was so excited about these opportunities that I was working on real-world assets and deep-in projects that were way ahead of their time. And frankly, they didn't have enough scale to be able to work. But there was one industry that they'd figured out how to use Ethereum for, and that was fundraising. The infamous idea of ICOs, the initial coin offerings, emerged on the back of ERC-20 tokens. And there was an explosion in 2017, 2018 of money that was raised. But inevitably, because a lot of that was built on similar problems of having to trust the entities in the middle that were doing this, the bubble burst. And it was quite a famous, another collapse. We got up to 19,000 in Bitcoin at that point, and we fell all the way down to around, 8,000, I think it was, at the bottom at that point. But what's interesting is that when you have these bubbles throughout history, we've seen moments when there is a lot of speculation. What it does is it drives innovation, because that capital becomes cheap when there's this funding being placed in this way. And it allows people to innovate and build. And we saw this in the dot-com boom at the turn of the century, when, in fact, there was an explosion of money going into the space. And everybody focused on the losses that happened. But at the end of the day, it meant that there was innovation going on in things like Google and Facebook and everything else. Well, the same thing was happening, I would argue, in the blockchain space. Whenever you have these speculative bubbles, there's a lot of money that gets lost, made as well, and lost. But there's also this capacity to actually unlock capital and produce a lot of infrastructure that we can build upon. In the blockchain space, it's about open source code. And when that open source code is now available, new innovations get built, and it's relatively cheap because the price has now been affected by this marketplace. So at this time, we were getting Cardano and Near and Solana and Algorand and lots of other layer 1s, and we also saw layer 2s start to emerge that were giving Ethereum a lot more efficiency. These are roll-ups that were making Ethereum scale. Oops, we're not moving here. Here we go. And it set us up for some things. We had this NFT boom that happened. The Bored Apes were part of all of that. And there was this DeFi summer, this composable idea of financial systems being built on top of permissionless models and all these other brand new ideas about how we unlock liquidity and create sort of de facto systems for managing collateral and everything else. A very exciting time emerged. Even though we just come out of a boom, the building was going on, the biddle, as we used to call it. And this set us up for this boom. And ironically, it happened around the time of COVID, which was a major crisis for the global economy, of course, and global society. Now, at that time, I had left MIT, where I'd gone off to work on these projects, and had moved on to Coindesk, where I was brought on to, as it was mentioned earlier, I was the chairman of Consensus, this big conference. And all of a sudden, my very first Consensus, we had to go offline, and we had to go online and not in real life. And so we had 100,000 people online at the time following the conference. But if you remember, the first moment of COVID, Bitcoin price collapsed, and there's a little blip down the bottom down there. That was the low point of about $3,000. But then it took off because, if there was ever an industry that was made for sort of nomadic existence and working online, it was blockchain. So we had a boom at that time, and there was also an enormous amount of money that was being unleashed into the system, quantitative easing coming from the Federal Reserve, and it all flooded into Bitcoin, which got us up to just shy of 70,000 at the peak there. And then we had the time of Gensler, so everything went all the way back down again because Gary Gensler, who I happened to work with at MIT, headed up the SEC and took a very hardline position toward the industry. I don't really need to talk much about it. I think you're all aware of that period. And there was this sort of rather gloomy moment, certainly in the United States, that led to a big sell-off. And ultimately, in addition to that, we had a number of high-profile failures that it sort of exemplified the concerns people had about the industry. But I will point out that while the US was being especially draconian over the last 4 years, we've had significant improvements in the clarity around regulations elsewhere in the world. You've got the micro in EU, the UAE has made some big changes. Japan itself, having learnt from Mt. Gox, has introduced some, I think, good, reliable regulations. Singapore has been at the forefront of trying to drive the financial system into this space. And of course, Korea, where you've just had, as we heard, the propagation of new laws for this space. And then, of course, El Salvador, not quite into the regulatory space, but a huge move in legalizing Bitcoin and actually buying it as part of their reserves. But there was a lot of focus at the same time as all this was going on these high-profile, events where Sam Bankman-Fried and CZ became sort of like the poster childs of some of the problems here. One of them won and one of them lost. Sam Bankman-Fried is in jail and CZ went to jail, but Binance is going strong. And I think it just speaks to, again, the fact that we have a lot of volatility, a lot of change, and a lot of focus on these individuals as important leaders, which is good, but isn't entirely within the spirit of what this technology is all about. We're supposed to be trusting the math. The consensus is broad, the system. But we're back, and what's ironic here, of course, is that this slide, I made these slides just 2 weeks ago, so I realized I probably should have updated them, but you get the story, right? In the space of just 2 weeks, this is a very outdated slide. 70,000, well, we're actually at 90, as we know. Now, we can talk a little bit about why that's the case, but I just think it's important to also focus on how a lot of these technologies, these ideas that were emerging when I first got interested in blockchain. As I said, I was at MIT looking at DePIN as a way to develop microgrids for solar energy, and I was really interested in property rights, and therefore I was looking at real estate online. But it was so ahead of its time, we just didn't have the capacity and the technology, and there wasn't the interest of mainstream finance in backing this. But it's coming. It's really there. We're seeing tokenization projects. We're seeing companies like BlackRock, VanEck, Fidelity, and others supporting ETFs, which of course were boosted by the regulatory support for those, certainly with Bitcoin and ETH in the US. And a lot of innovation happening, right? Restaking, so the proof of stake technology behind Ethereum now being turned into a mechanism to actually build things and rely on that underlying piece of trust without having to build vulnerable connections between them. And I myself am very, very interested in the intersection of blockchain and artificial intelligence, which is where I now am, because in the midst of all of this, with all of the volatility that was going on within our space, CoinDesk went through a lot and ultimately got sold to a company called Bullish, and we parted ways. And so earlier this year, I ended my time at CoinDesk, and then I stayed on as chairman of Consensus until May. But now I'm running a company called the Decentralized AI Society, because I feel as if this is the moment to bring an intersection between this technology and artificial intelligence. And I think Vino and I are going to talk a little bit later on about why this is so important. So where do we go from now, right? I do think AI is the killer use case, the one thing that is going to actually prove the fundamental importance of having the capacity to own our own data, to collectively own the system, to prove the reliability of information, and ultimately get away from this dependency on these centralized systems, in particular the massive platforms that run our world. Obviously, again, these slides was 2 weeks ago, the US election impact. I don't even really need to answer that question. We've seen the immediate response that's happened in terms of how people feel as if the new administration coming into the United States is going to remove a lot of the regulatory barriers. And it's pretty hard to imagine that there is not going to be a continued degree of excitement, development, innovation, and probably some big market impacts still to come as a result of that. But I do think that we need to be thinking as well about what the long-term implications of the current policy framework is. And there are still big questions as to whether the Trump administration is going to be constructive in the long run for everything that we care about in this space. We're seeing the convergence of Web3 and blockchain with metaverse, with AI agents, with wearables, this moment where IoT meets blockchain with DePIN services and the like coming together, I think is a really interesting moment. We're getting to this point where it starts to merge into this idea of the Internet of Value. And we're going to look, the big question for me is, are we going to have a future in which we are self-sovereign of our data, of our content, of our participation in the world? Or are we going to be subservient to these gigantic platforms? And speaking of them, again, this slide's a little out of date. There was, just 2 weeks ago, those 6 largest platforms, you all know who they are, had a war chest of $16 trillion, or $15 trillion back then, and now they're looking at $16 trillion, because the market has moved even higher, and Tesla is now the 7th largest. And so these companies have an enormous amount of power because of the war chest they have. This is essentially a currency. And in our space, I think we need to be thinking about how do we compete with that? So still got scaling problems we have to deal with. Engineering is challenging in this space. We have a problem with the UI, UX experience. People, the average person still, I think, has a very hard time necessarily navigating across chains with digital assets of all stripes. But I would say the biggest problem in some respects is our tribalism, that each token community is really looking out for their own token and fighting amongst themselves, when in many respects what we need to do is come together and figure out interoperability. The competition is important, obviously, but it's also important that we figure out how to raise money, address the standards, and so forth, so that we can compete with these bigger players. And that's what my new organization, the Decentralized AI Society, is all about. So anybody who wants to hear about that, please come and talk to me about it. It's about bringing the industry together so we can fight the big AI fight together. So that's all for now. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm going to, I think, be joined on stage now by Vino so we can have a bit of a conversation about this.
First of all, I'd like to thank Michael for making this trip to UDC. And as in your presentation, you are a true witness to the growth of the industry. You're a thought leader in our industry. And it's very interesting to follow your story, to understand what happened over the past 10 years or so. I have a bunch of questions. I think 20 minutes is not going to do justice. But let me start off. You mentioned that you kind of highlighted the dangers of the current highly centralized internet system. And you emphasized the importance of third-generation internet. And so what are your thoughts on the adaptation of Web3?
Yeah, so I think one of the challenges that we face and have faced even before the arrival of blockchain, when it comes to trying to compete with the existing systems, Meta, Facebook, Google, and so forth, is that it's very hard to get the average person to migrate away from all of the convenience that comes from those systems. So we can talk about the reason for privacy purposes, the risks that come from data that's being essentially absorbed and used against you. Here's an important line from Bruce Schneier, a leading cryptographer and security expert, who said some time ago, and some of you would have heard this quote, you are not Facebook's customer, you are Facebook's product, right? That you're being manipulated, essentially, by them controlling your data and building. That is a very unhealthy way to run an economy, and even more unhealthy way to run an information system. So Frank McCourt and I wrote a book about this earlier this year called Our Biggest Fight, which really talks about the imperative of doing this. But for all of the screaming about how dangerous it is and how bad it is for society, people just like, well, you know what? Doesn't matter. I've got nothing to hide. I don't care about my privacy. And they don't understand all of the sort of the bigger aspects of this. I think that some of that is changing. But even if they do understand it, it's hard because it's so much easier to stay on Facebook where all of my friends are. So we need to be thinking hard about how, if you want adoption, you have to make these applications be not only better from a moral or imperative perspective, but also to be really cool, and engaging and fun. And so this is where the attention is going to have to go. Now, I will say, and we're going to be talking about AI ahead on this, but AI does change the dynamics because the web itself, the very first expression, Web 3.0, is a little anachronistic, because in my mind, the web is going to disappear because AI agents are going to act on our behalf. We're going to build these machines that will trade for us, buy our clothes for us, decide on what education. There is this world that will emerge fairly quickly of some machine acting on your behalf. Now, those machines have to be trusted, and that's where blockchain can come into this. But at the same time, those machines do not need websites. They don't read human-readable. They read machine-readable things. So one can imagine the web itself going away. But I do think that there's an opportunity within there to really get people to think about the value of these blockchain-based systems, because an AI agent that is operating on my behalf and placing trades on my behalf and buying things and really being me, an agent in the true sense, damn well better understand, that it's actually working for me. I need to know what's underneath that, and that data provenance part of the blockchain is really, really important in that. So there's an opportunity to make these things quite viable.
If I understand you correctly, I've been hearing from Web3 service providers that the biggest challenge for them is the usability, the UX, UI. It's very inconvenient to use Web3 services. And you're saying that the AI agents will act as a kind of interface between the web and the user itself.
So I think it's really interesting, right? So it's an absolutely spot-on point that the UX has been very difficult, especially for cross-chain translations. But remember, this is also difficult in the existing web. When you have to take all of your contact list from Google and shift it into your Spotify list, right? There's the lack of interoperability across all these platforms because they're all siloed, they're all black boxes. And we've tended to think in the Web3 world of saying, how do we fix the protocols? How do we make sure that they all interface? But the problem is a human one, right? It creates a brain space problem for us. There's the friction involved in having to make these decisions and understanding what to do and remembering all the steps. An AI agent could just make all that go away because they don't, a computer's not going to care about the complexity of all of that. So the solution may not lie in making all the protocols interoperate and creating cross-chain, and it might just leave it as it is, but the AI agent abstracts away all of that. And so that may be actually one of the ways to solve some of these problems.
Interesting. We'll come back to the AI subject in a moment, but your experience with Consensus. You've been the chairman of Consensus. Tell me about your experiences with that event. It's the largest event in the industry.
So, I mean, I written a number of books in this space. I wrote with Paul Vigneault, I mentioned earlier. We wrote The Age of Cryptocurrency in 2015, and then in 2018 we wrote a book called The Truth Machine. And in that book, then, that was only after there'd been four consensuses at that point. I used consensus as a way to describe the pathways of the industry. It's been a very useful event to sort of say, okay, where are things at? It's like the compass test check. But it's also a measure of its rise because the very first consensus was 500 people at an event in New York. And at that stage, CoinDesk, we need to diversify our revenues because the advertising budgets had fallen. This was when the Bitcoin price had fallen. Nobody was buying mining machines and rigs anymore. You used to be able to sell those and buy them on CoinDesk. So where are we going to get our money from? They launched the first consensus. And at that point, everyone's talking about enterprise blockchain, right? We had all these banks, DTCC, we had the supply chain conversation, everything. And Citibank Ventures came in and funded the initial consensus. So it was an early foray into the space from Citibank, and ironically, Citi ended up really not doing a lot more with it after that. But that was the beginning of it. And then we had 1,500 the next year, and then we had 4,000 the next. And then in 2018 was the peak moment, 8,000 people into the Hilton in New York. The escalators were jammed. You couldn't get up there. It was a scaling problem, another scaling problem for Consensus itself. Somebody thought it was a good idea to buy out the parking space out the front of the conference and put two Lamborghinis sitting in there. So there were articles in all of the New York magazines about these horrible crypto bros and their excessive behavior. And then sure enough, as often happens at Consensus, pretty much immediately afterwards, that is the peak, and boom, it fell down, and we had the collapse. And then we had COVID, right? And as I said, I started at CoinDesk at that point, and we had to take it all into an online environment because we couldn't have live events. And then I think the most memorable one for me was 2022 when we went to Austin for the first time. We realized we had to move out of New York and do something bigger. And we had 20,000 people, and that was a hugely uplifting event. We were very, very proud of what we achieved. It was it was very positive, very uplifting. But the very next morning, I remember looking at my phone, and the first thing I read was that Celsius, one of the big exchanges at that time, or the lending platform, was canceling withdrawals.
Oh, no.
And so we had a contagion crisis underway, and one thing led to another, and a few months later, CoinDesk itself was breaking the news of FTX's problems, and we were going into an even deeper spiral. So Consensus has this weird role of being there at the booms and busts. But it's a great event. It's one that I think I'm very proud of, because I like to talk about it as being the gathering of the tribes, right? It's the one big tent event when everybody who's all arguing and fighting and going off in different directions and really not necessarily paying a lot of attention comes together and tries to figure out what's going on and sort of course corrects and moves on. So I think it's, as I said, I mean, my new organization as well, I'm a big believer in convening, in making sure that you have all of the mechanisms for building community, for opening conversation, for opening dialogue, and that out of that we can build better, more reliable, more interoperable systems. So Consensus in some respects is this large version of trying to achieve that through the gathering of the tribes.
We've been having UDC for the past 7 years, and my experience is that the themes change every year.
Yeah.
First it was POW versus POS, and then we had NFT suddenly on the rise, and that was very hot. And today, it's RWA.
Yeah.
Did you see that also?
Absolutely. There's always some theme that is different, some new hot thing. And yeah, I think that's the nice thing about having an annual event. I mean, this wouldn't be the case in any other industry, because things wouldn't change from year to year as quickly, right? It just shows how fast things move. I mean, we talk about, I think, crypto time being considerably shorter than normal time, because it's like you live a lifetime in the 12 years that I've been doing this. It's the change is just so rapid.
Very conveniently, UDC today is opened after the U.S. presidential elections, and we have to talk about this.
It's the,
like it or not.
I say the elections are the elephant in the room. I'm not describing any human being on either side of the aisle as an elephant, but I'm saying that it is the topic that we do need to talk about for sure.
And we're feeling the effects of
Absolutely.
the new incoming government in the U.S. What do you think? Is this a fad? Is it going to go away, or do you think it's impacts on a long term?
It's definitely more than a fad, right? I think it's undeniable that the regulatory constraints that have been placed on this industry under the prior administration are very were quite harmful, certainly in the United States, to the ability to build. And you see so many financial institutions that want to get involved, but are very concerned about the compliance risk associated with that. If you remove that overhang, I think you have a much better chance of bringing in mainstream organizations and banks into this space, and therefore locking up or unlocking capital and enabling a much bigger opening up of the system. But I do think that we need to be wary of, again, it's the same thing, investing all of our hope in one entity or one person, right? Whether it's Sam Bankman-Fried or Mt. Gox or Donald Trump, they are not our saviors, right? And their interest not necessarily in saving us. We have to save ourselves, right? We've got to build systems that are anti-fragile, that can survive no matter what. And I think that we need to be a little careful about putting all of our eggs in one basket, and I don't know that it's very healthy to have the richest human being in the world sitting in government. As much as we may or may not love Elon Musk, it's the same problem, right? He's one person. Mm-hmm. We believe in this technology because it is not relying on human beings, right? So I think these are the things to think about. The other thing I would say is that, between now and the end of the second Trump administration's term, the world is going to look very, very different. We have never had a transformational technology like AI come in at the beginning of a presidential election term like this and see such change. And so I certainly didn't hear much from either of the candidates talking about what they were going to do to ensure that AI is safe for humans and that AI allows for positive innovation for the sake of the planet, and that what they're going to do about the challenges to jobs and everything else, right? And I think that's the thing to think about here is like, okay, we've solved yesterday's problem of what the regulatory framework for crypto assets is, but how do we solve for tomorrow's problem, which is coming at us very, very fast? And I think it's, it's fundamental that we look at the AI problem through the lens of blockchain. Whether or not it is the magic bullet is a different question, but I would really like to see, you know, the policy direction here start to think hard about what that means.
This kind of leads to a natural transition into the subject of blockchain and AI and how they can come together. It seems that people were talking about blockchain, how it would change the future, and all of a sudden everybody's talking about AI. How do these two come together, do you think? And because of the inherent dangers or threats that AI can pose, how can we overcome that?
Well, first of all, I'd just say, like, I think it's kind of silly that we compartmentalize everything as we do. I think we humans want to have very easily classifiable constructs with which to think about the world, to direct our investments and to make decisions. But the idea that somehow AI is a distinct thing from blockchain, I mean, they are different technologies, but that, you know, there are all these VCs that when the Web3 bubble burst, they were all saying, I'm no longer investing in Web3, I'm investing in AI. It's like, well, why can't they be mutually exclusive? Why do they have to be mutually exclusive? Why isn't there a connection here? And I fundamentally believe that there is. And again, it comes from thinking about Web 2. So Web 2 is this concentration of power in the hands of centralized, trusted entities. You know, Meta, Alphabet, we keep talking about them. These same entities, the most powerful organizations the world has ever seen. And they're most powerful not just because they're wealthy, but because they own our data. And your data is who you are in the digital age. The footprints you leave around the world, the followers that you have, the friends that you make, connections that you draw, all of that is a direct expression of you as a human being. Your data is your personhood. So the idea that these 6 platforms could own that and control that and manipulate that without us knowing is extremely dangerous. And as I said, we wrote a book talking about the harm that has done. We've got suicide rates amongst children and teens higher than we've ever seen before. We've got a whole host of problems. It's not to say that social media is bad, the internet is bad, but rather that the model that's been created, which has an incentive built around it to obviously to turn as much profit as they can, is not the right model to have. We need one that is incentivized differently. So this is where blockchain comes in, because blockchain is a very different paradigm. It's a structure that says, you know, the ownership is shared, right? We tokenize things and we get to broaden the ownership. And so the idea that we could collectively own this is better. So as we are going through this process of taking the Web 2 technology, which, by the way, is also AI, right? These are algorithms that Facebook and Google were running. Google is an algorithmic search process. It's not really even search. It's an algorithm that is prioritizing information as to what it thinks we need. So we're taking that algorithmic world, and we're moving into an even faster and bigger and more dangerous one. Why on earth would we take the Web 2 structure that we have now and put it into that world? It would be the most dangerous, stupid thing in the world. So we really need to think hard about what the incentive structures are for the AI economy. And as I said, I think tokenizing ownership of the compute that goes into this, the ability to have ownership of your data and be able to track where that data is going and know that what your data is, what data you've contributed to a model that's being developed is being used as you would want it to be. All of that, I think, is very, very important. And look, to be clear, it's not easy, because AI depends upon a massive amount of compute, right? It brings together these high-powered NVIDIA H100 and now H200 chips, clusters them into these data centers and generates an enormous amount of information through this massive data throughput. And it's hard to do that in a blockchain because distributed computation is very expensive. But the beauty about this industry is that these are the smartest people anywhere, and they're very good at thinking outside of the box. So rather than thinking about how do I jam more computation into this system, they're thinking about different models. Maybe we don't do the same LLM foundational model that OpenAI is doing. We have parallel compute, or we use modular situations. And all of that allows us to then think differently about how we can apply the blockchain to this. I also think that payments are going to have to be very important in the AI age. How is an AI going to trade with another AI? If not, are they going to wait to settle until the banks open on Monday, and then make sure that the deal gets done at 5? These are AIs that they can easily front run each other, right? We need atomic swap capability, we need online, on-chain settlement, and we need transparency around how all those things are working. So smart contracts, I think, are going to be fundamental to the emergence of these AI agents. And AI agents are where things are going, right? So there's this idea that we're going to build 1 billion of these things. Every one of us is going to have this agent, or maybe more than one agent, that operates on our behalf. There's no way that that massive pool of computational activity can pass through this one data center in the middle of it. We're going to have to push the compute out to the edges. We're going to have our devices, our televisions, our iPhones, our galaxies, all of them talking to each other and doing it locally. Now, the question is, are we going to be able to collectively own that ourselves, and so that process is now tokenized and belongs to everybody? Or will it be owned by one of those big 7 players? Because we're going to want those agents to act as agents. Under the legal construct of what that is, they need to be representing us. So I think this is a do or die moment. We really need to push hard for how do we bring blockchain and crypto thinking into the future of AI.
I know we're running out of time, but a quick question about compliance. Digital assets have become more mainstream, and new challenges such as anti-money laundering and fraud detection systems are becoming an issue. And Dunamu, our company, has partnered with Hana Bank to share AML, FDS practices. However, there's no doubt that the industry is evolving. Now, how do you think that will impact the future of blockchain?
So, I mean, it's unavoidable, right? I think it's hard that we can think of these sort of big, expansive, converged worlds of blockchain and IoT and AI without trying to grapple with the questions of identity and privacy, which then go against some of the requirements of AML and KYC. But I do think that there's a real opportunity, if you're going to be creative around this, to try to make sure that the old world and the new world can actually work together. And I think that some of the interesting projects around self-sovereign identity and like KYC bureaus, and the idea that we can bring a lot of that KYC process on-chain and bring privacy, zero-knowledge proofs and so forth into it. So that, yes, there's going to have to be somebody that's checking that you are who you say you are, but that we're not broadcasting that to the world and enabling a much more kind of cryptography-based model behind it. If we can get that right, then we can keep the regulators happy and the banks happy, but at the same time, build some very exciting new technologies for the future.
Thank you. I'm sorry, we are out of time. Thank you very much for your insightful comments, and thank you to the audience for listening to us.
Thank you, Vina. Good.
Thank you very much.